Hi, everybody, and welcome to this Nova 111 talk with none other than Gerda Larsson, CEO of Curitas Venture and a strong advocate for gender equality and entrepreneurship. This conversation will last until 1 p.m. and will be divided into three parts. First, I will give you a very brief introduction to Nova and what the Nova 111 list is, and then we will focus on the reason why we're here, the conversation with Gerda, of course, and we'll also finish the last 15 minutes or so with a Q&A where we will pose your questions to Gerda, and you can post them in the chat, but in order to do so, you need to create a YouTube profile. That should only take you, it should take you less than a minute. And please post your questions during our conversation also when they pop up, and we'll make sure to try to lift them during the Q&A. My name is Niklas Obel, for those of you who don't know me, and I've worked at Nova since March of 2020. And I'm leading our company in the Nordics. Many of you listeners are Nova members, but for those of you who are not familiar with Nova, Nova is a by invitation top talent network born in Sweden in 1997. Today we are 12,000 members plus all over the world, out of which 7,000 of those members are located in the Nordics. Our main objective at Nova is to connect and develop our members and accelerate their development careers, and also basically to help them reach their full potentials and the impact that they have in their organizations and also on society at large. And the Nova network was actually born from a talent list called the Nova 100. And in 2020, we decided it was time to launch a new kind of talent list, the Nova 111. Which is Sweden's and Spain's, where we launched the list. It's the first evidence-based talent list here, and we presented 10 stars in 11 categories, all under the age of 35. And these had been selected through a scientific and evidence-based selection process involving both IQ tests and personality tests, as well as video interviews. And each nominee was then reviewed by a jury of industry experts as well as assessment professionals, all in all over 55 jury members. And the jury selected one outstanding talent in each category, the jury's choice. And in this series of conversations, we will have the privilege to meet these superstars. So please enjoy this conversation with Gerda Larsson, who was the jury's choice winner of the social impact vertical. Welcome, Gerda.
Thank you. Thank you. Honored to be here today.
Great. When we just talked before, I heard that you just got back from a marriage. Congratulations on that.
Well, thank you. It was actually my second marriage with the same man. So we first got married in Sweden, and last week we also got married in Iran. So double party.
How has it been?
It's been great. I must say that it's when you have a wedding during COVID, it's nice that you can divide the parties and have two instead, and then combined, it's the same amount of guests we would have had in one non-COVID wedding.
That sounds like a good way to arrange it given the circumstances. So I think the focus of today's talk is, of course, to focus more about getting to know you and also your story, but also, of course, how you sort of have tackled your career, focusing and on really important questions and so on. But before we get into that, let's rewind the tape. Tell us about your early years. Where are you from, and how was it growing up there?
So I'm from a suburb outside of Stockholm called Bromsten, located in between Spånga and Rinkeby. It was a great place to grow up. I think I had quite a normal childhood. I lived in the same house, grew up with two older siblings, and just as all kids, enjoyed doing sports and going to school. The only thing I would say was a little bit different for me than other kids was maybe that I changed school quite often, even though I stayed in the same house, which now that I get older, I think about maybe is one reason to how I became such an extrovert and love meeting new people, because I had to at a young age.
What schools did you attend to, and how did that, you know?
So quite a classic, like academic parents wanting to make sure that I got the best education, and thus when hearing about different teachers that I would have moved me around to different schools in the local neighborhood in order to assure high quality education. So I mean, in some areas, unfortunately, that leads to different kinds of drainage of students of a certain kind. But I think, I mean, for me, it was socially super interesting and important. But on a strategic scale, maybe there's actually an issue there that we can talk about some other time.
Yeah, that can be for the second conversation. I actually didn't grew up quite close to where you grew up, in close to Vällingby and Nälsta. So yeah.
We both became professional adults, so something was right about that area.
Exactly. Something worked. So and then I heard in another podcast you talked about actually convincing your parents that it was a good idea to allow you to move abroad and sort of drop out of high school early on. Can you tell me a bit about that experience?
Yeah, so I think I always had a passion for traveling, and also, you know, I kind of always live in the future, for the good and the bad. And I was attending high school, and I told my parents I wanted to move to Spain to become a professional dancer, flamenco dancer. And after a bit of convincing, I actually managed to. Or after a bit of nagging them, maybe more, I managed to convince them that this was a good idea. I mean, I think one was the dancing, and that I love doing that. Just like, to be honest, I'm not good at dancing, but I like to do it, which is maybe two different things. But the reason also that I chose to do it in Spain and that I really wanted to go there was that I had a dream about working in Latin America when I grew older, and I thought this was a good way to learn Spanish. So it was really hitting, you know, what do you say? Two birds with one stone. Is that the expression? Yeah. I went, I spent a year dancing, and after only being offered a contract at a lunch restaurant in South Korea, I realized that my career was over, and I came home and actually started excelling much more in school because I had that gap year. And I think, you know, the regular school system is made for you to go to school for a certain amount of years, and maybe that doesn't work for everyone. And for me, I needed a natural break then to finish the 2 last years of high school and getting better grades than I would ever have gotten otherwise.
I think that's it's such a wonderful story about finding sort of motivation in one area or the other. I mean, if you would have excelled, of course, it could have been a really interesting career as well as flamenco dancer, but just, I mean, the downside wasn't, you know, it was actually quite, from what I can tell, really interesting learning experience. I actually told my own kids about that the other night, because it's, I mean, like walking your own path. It's also about, you know, finding sometimes where you maybe don't have that excellent future that you believed. So. And then you came home then with a newfound sort of drive and passion for school, I suppose. Where did that take you in the coming years?
Well, I think it definitely. So I attended a high school in Jakobsberg called Samgymnasiet that was actually had a special line to go to. It was called Global, and now there's a global gymnasium in Sweden and such things. But back then that did not exist. So we actually read about all the subjects that you would read about. But for example, when we read the history about the Second World War, we read from the perspective of North African countries and how they got involved in the Second World War. And we also had these studies that back then was called development country studies, where we also traveled to Uganda for 1 month and did the field studies. And it was a really interesting school and a really interesting way of getting exposed to not only the Swedish writing of history or about society, but also taking on other perspectives. And that made school much more interesting for me, at least. And I think it also, that has stayed with me throughout all my studies after that too.
Cool. And then, I mean, when you were at university, you studied at Stockholm University, and you know, how was young Gerda then, and what were your thoughts in terms of, you know, what did you actually think that you would wanted to do, and what were you aspiring to do, basically?
I mean, so when I was younger, I definitely thought I wanted to work at the UN or work in the field in some country. I was very oriented towards living abroad, and I mean, I love now living in Stockholm and Sweden, but it's also great to be in other places. But I think I started university and I started studying urban and regional planning. And again, I studied right after high school. So after attending a couple of years of studies at university, I felt again it was time for me to take a break and do something else. And I had this interest in architecture, and I have been wanting to travel for a long time to Azerbaijan to look at their architecture. So I started to apply for jobs there, and I couldn't find any jobs. So I actually found this job in Armenia, working with women who had been subjected to trafficking and then gotten back to Armenia and being their point of contact. And I applied for that job and I got it. But 2 weeks later, I had rented out my flat. I had, quit university, and they gave me a call from Armenia saying, well, the thing is, we made a political campaign and we lost our office space, so we can't take you anymore. Okay. And I was like, okay, what do I do now? So the next morning when I woke up, I had a message on Facebook from a Georgian NGO called Women's Information Center saying, hey, we heard from our sister organization in Armenia that you were going to go there and now you can't. Would you like to come to Georgia instead? So a week later, I moved to Georgia, the country, then not the state, as you might understand. And I started engaging in women's rights locally, working a lot on strengthening civil society. And I think from there, really my passion around funding started, because I could start seeing how colonial development aid still was, and how we still had donor-driven agendas that set the standards of what people should be doing. And that kind of have stayed with me now for, 12 years, as I've been working on different issues of how to improve funding and make funding better.
We will definitely dive into that later, the financing part and so on. But it's really interesting here. Basically, your interest in architecture, seems sparked that interest of going abroad. How did the interest regarding women's rights actually come into that?
Yeah. But that's a good question. I think it's always been there. I mean, I think most of women share certain stories in common of how we have experience being treated differently or experience different obstacles that we have met, and we haven't. Not everyone has always, and I haven't always been able to put words to it. But I remember when I went to high school and we read this text about radical feminism, and it said like women are being judged on the basis of their gender differently than men. And I was like, aha, there's a word for this. This is what it is. And for many people, maybe high school is also late that came, but that's really when I understand that, like, this is a whole movement and you can engage in these questions. And then, of course, like architecture was a big interest, but an interest of why I applied to going to urban and regional planning at university was because I'm interested in how people move in the city, because we all have different ways of moving depending on what power structure exists, who belongs at Östermalm in Stockholm, uptown Stockholm, who feels that they belong here on Södermalm where I sit. And really, I think that like gender has always been a part of my analysis, but it wasn't until I started engaging at Women's Information Center in Georgia where I started working like full time on those questions only.
And if people, will visit your LinkedIn profile, which I think most people that are listening in will, I mean, then you have, a massive amount of experience from various NGOs. Are there anything that you want to lift, especially from those, before we get into the organization that you co-founded called the Case for Her?
No, but I think like if you look at my CV, you get a little bit confused because you don't understand it because it's too many things that have been happening at the same time. But I think that's been my idea of, we're talking here about talent and career and such things. I haven't been looking for a career. I said yes to all the opportunities that come towards me, and I've seen it as a learning journey, that everywhere I go, I can learn something new. And I think that's like kind of how I've come to grow as a person, and also how my professional life has evolved.
This is something that I personally, since I've been working with talent in one way or the other, for the past 20 plus years, I'm a bit both impressed by and also inspired by, and I want to talk a little bit more about that, and we can get into it right away since we're touching on the subject. I mean, it's you have, from a, like, especially for a CEO in a venture capital, quite an odd background, but it's truly inspiring. I think it seems very much that you've chosen your path based on issues and questions that you really have a passion for. Can you tell us a little bit about like how your thought process has been around that, or has it been more organically evolving?
I mean, I think it's been kind of organically evolving, and then it involves a little bit of luck, and then it involves a little bit of, of course, passion and drive. So once when I had been working in Georgia, I had been home and I was gonna fly back, and I was flying through Prague, and I was sitting in the as the flight was going down to land, and the guy next to me starts talking to me, and he starts talking about private equity, starts talking about venture capital, and I hardly understand the word. I mean, I was 22 at that time, but we just continue the conversation. And when I leave the airport or the airplane, he knocks me on my shoulder and he says, "By the way, you seem interesting. I want to hire you when you get back to Sweden." So I go off the plane. This was before we had smartphones, so that's how old we are. So I bought some internet at the airport, and I googled the guy, and it says Mikael Ahlström, founder of Curitas, the first venture capital or private equity firm in the Scandinavian countries. And of course, I called him up when I got back, and I went to his office, all nicely dressed and ready with my CV and my letter of recommendation and everything. And he said, well, do you want to start taking care of my personal philanthropy? And I said yes. And he asked, can you start tomorrow? And he didn't even look at my papers, because he could see that I had a passion and drive for what I was doing, and he was willing to give me a chance. So of course, that was a combination of manage to impress someone, but also being lucky enough to actually take that conversation at an airplane once. And I mean, that took me on a lot of these learning journeys, as we were talking about before, saying yes to every opportunity that kind of came along. And even though it didn't matter if I was working with his personal philanthropy or if I was working at this real estate company, which I also came to do later, I was pushing an agenda that just comes from inside of me, I would say, which is a feminist activist agenda, where I was asking questions. So, how do we judge people differently? What kind of culture are we building? How are we working with language at these companies? How do we speak with each other? But also about, for example, at the real estate company, how do we talk about the tenants? And pushing that through. So I think that everywhere I gone, doesn't matter, I've always had this drive to ask these questions, and I think everyone can be a feminist activist in that way at their workplace, or push their agenda, because there's nothing harm with asking, and worst case scenario, you get a no, and then you just continue. I mean, so it's really been a mixture of kind of doing everything. But then I got the opportunity. I mean, I was really, after a few years, looking for an opportunity to work fully on my passion. And that's when I came to co-found The Case for Her, which is a philanthropic investment portfolio investing in women's health, where we actually took the best of nonprofit and the best of the for-profit world, merged it, and created an investment portfolio that used investments as an advocacy tool to bring women's health issues to the global health agenda.
Tell us more about that. That's really interesting, because I mean, for those that haven't read up on The Case for Her in detail, tell us about the business model, and also what questions you were working with, of course.
So, I mean, the business model of The Case for Her was to, as I said, use the best tools from these different sides and try to advocate for change. So we actually started a few different investment streams or portfolios within the portfolio. So one of them was in menstrual health, where we actually built one of the largest investment portfolios in menstrual health in the world, which also, to say, very few people invest in that. So maybe it doesn't make it the biggest fund ever, but it was substantial enough. And we used that then to get more people interested in investing in these areas. So menstrual health is a super important component to several of the SDGs. For example, of course, gender equality, but also access to water and sanitation. It also goes into education. I mean, if we can increase the amount of girls that attend school, we actually increase the GDP of a country by almost a full % per year. So it's it has crazy effects on the global development agenda. But then we also launched one in female sexual health, which was trying to destigmatize female sexuality, and later also a safe abortion portfolio.
You mentioned in some other interview that it's actually the only global goal that not one single country has achieved is gender equality. Can we take just a minute? I think that's fascinating. I mean, it's on everybody's lips, even in a country as Sweden, for a very, very long time. And
yeah.
It's
it's mind-blowing. No, there's one goal that no country in the world has achieved, and it's gender equality, and we're hundreds of years from achieving that. And even in some of the most equal countries like Sweden, we're so far off. And I think that that's an interesting way of putting it, because a lot of people often think, well, we come so far. Yeah, we have, but we're not even close to what equality would actually mean. And I mean, I love, maybe you've seen all of these memes that go around and, like, I mean, we're only asking for half. We're not asking for more than half, which maybe we should, after being treated like this for generations. So I mean, but the thing with gender equality is that there's only a certain amount of power. So someone has to give up power in order for someone else to get it. And I think that's one of the issues. And it's the same. Well, now working in venture capital and seeing the statistics here, I mean, 1% of venture capital goes to women in Sweden, and 11% to teams co-founded by men and women, and 88% go somewhere else. So, or to men.
That's fascinating. I had no idea about those statistics. So you mean, and what capital are we talking about here? Like, is it all investments, or is it like what kind of stage and so on?
So yeah, what's called venture capital, but then it's from seed stage to up to, I mean, higher series B or D. Yeah. But I would say that even if you look at the if you look at the amount of money that's being invested, it's actually less money that goes into the female founded companies. So not only are there less companies getting the funding that they get is also less, which is crazy, and this is in one of the most equal worlds or countries in the world.
Yeah, you tend to think that in investment it's quite driven by irrational, or you tend to think that way anyway. What is your take on that? Why is it that way?
Yeah, but of course, it has to do with bias in many ways. It has to do it has to do with who's the investor and who gets to place money. Because we can also see that even though more and more women are coming into VCs, there are very few women that holds a position where you actually decide over where the money is going. But I mean, just to be fair, being a woman doesn't mean that you're not biased against women. I mean, we all grew up in the same society where we think that women are very risk averse, where we learn that maybe, women, family life, how are you going to manage it all? And all of these questions that we're all having in our heads, even though we don't want to, I guess. So of course, bias is one of them. Unconscious bias, we've been talking about for ages, that people don't know that they have these biases. I think it's time that we start talking about that is an issue, that people are just biased. I mean, with the Me Too movement and everything that happens and all the statistics that are out there, that female fund managers or first-time fund managers have bigger successes than male first-time fund managers. We know that female-founded companies have higher success rates than male-founded companies, but still, we're judging people, and of course, that's just because we're biased. We're biased towards men, and there's a lot of men sitting making those decisions.
Yeah, it's that's really fascinating. So you mentioned, of course, one thing is that the fund managers, to a large extent, the large majority are men themselves. You mentioned the biases. Are there any other factors that come up to your mind that's behind that? Because, like you say, I mean, female founders have even better, track record than their male counterparts.
I mean, there's definitely not a lack of female funding or funders, but I would say that like a lot of people blame that there's not enough female funders and entrepreneurs, and I would say that that's wrong. But you have to maybe look in different fields. But it's also that a lot of entrepreneurs now, female entrepreneurs, are tackling issues that are considered female issues, or are considered, or are, for example, products with a female consumer market, which also means that it makes it even more difficult for a lot of the people making the investment decisions to understand what solutions will work, since they haven't maybe run into the problem. But if you think about that, on average in the world, 80% of the household money is being, women have power of around 80% of the money being spent in a household. You would want to market things for women in a larger extent, because they have a huge purchase power.
Going back a little bit to your own career and your life's choices, how did you actually end up at Curitas Venture? I mean, you were working full time with the case for her. Doing that
So I was
successfully.
working full time with the case for her. I was traveling 160 days per year and to about 14, 15 different countries, anything from El Salvador to Nepal to East Africa and the US. And I was, having the time of my life in so many ways, but and I think the case for her is like a dream come true to see something like that being built. But somehow I felt like, even though I loved working with female entrepreneurs, female funders, and female consumer products, like, are we really making, or am I making the biggest impact I can have if I'm not accessing the wealth of white, rich men, honestly? So somewhere in the back of my head has always been that, like, if they sit on the capital, it's that capital that we have to start shifting in order to make the larger societal impact that I would want to create. And well, I had a conversation with Mikael one day, the guy that I met on the plane back in the days. And I remember at one point in the conversation, well, he had called me up and he said, shouldn't we do something together again? And one part of the conversation, I said, well, what I really want to learn is that to access the capital of white middle-aged men. And he said, well, why don't you start with my capital then? Of course, it took a few more conversations than that, but it ended up becoming Curitas Ventures, where we are not a gender lens investment portfolio or anything like that. We're a regular venture capital firm, an investment company that just tries to be a little bit better, try to be innovative in the way we do things, and create change. I think that venture capital is a great way of creating change in the society, because it does decide what products are going to be in the market later, and what services that we can access. We launched it December last year, so it's pretty new and we're still learning a lot. And I mean, we're a startup investing in startups in many ways, but we directly started. We took in a bunch of private investments into the portfolio, so we had a base, and we made our first. So we launched in December. In January, we made our first diversity and inclusivity index. And we saw quite directly that even though we score pretty high on having female CEOs in our companies, if we look at board level, for example, we have much less women. How can we work with that? How do we recruit? We kind of directly understood that we recruit differently. If we are looking for a CEO to a company, we would always go out with an open call for that position, while we looked in our own networks for board members, for example. So how can we work with that in order to change the statistics? So even here, like, even though we're running a for-profit company, with my background and what I've been working on before, I always take with me, but how can we make it better? And with better, I mean that I think that diverse teams just have better revenue and better success, and it creates a better culture at those companies. So it's a win-win if we can invest in companies that make great workplaces for people. You know, everyone has a better situation.
Anything else that like sets Curitas, the idea behind Curitas, apart, and where you feel like this is something that, you know, we will bring to the world of venture capital that's sort of unique, or at least your thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I think as I said, we're still a startup and we're working on that vision and how we can be most innovative. We connect with a lot of other investors to try to learn from them how they've been working on these issues, and really looking at how we can be set apart or be different. But I think one thing that makes us different is just that Mikael has 40 years experience of venture capital, and he has started a lot of large companies and IPO'd and such things, and he dared hiring a feminist activist with an NGO background to actually run his his venture capital firm. And like, I have not taken any courses in economy or finance. I'm self-taught, and he dared taking a bet on that, and I dared taking a bet that we can create change from this kind of a strategic position. So I would say only that makes us different, and we try to get more people into our team that also think differently. So, for example, we have an intern right now, Sarah, who's she has such a good sense for affairs and how to make good business plans. But she's 21 and she hasn't finished high school. But I mean, that doesn't mean you can't be a great investor. So
looking like 3 to 5 years ahead here, where would you love for Curitas to be, and what kind of impact would you love to have had?
No, I would love to have had the impact that we continue these conversations. We are strategically engaging in a lot of questions. I'm a part of a group that has presented a report. We're 25 women working in venture capital, one from every European country, that wrote a report for the European Commission, where I represented Curitas Ventures, and where we're asking the EU Commission, for example, to set up a 3 billion euro fund, and the fund should be a fund for funds for female fund managers. Did you track that?
Yeah.
Fund that funds that are funded by women. And for example, seeing those kinds of strategic goals, being able to push through would be great. But then on a personal level, I also have a goal, as I said, around shifting capital and maybe capital that wouldn't be investing in these kinds of questions otherwise. So Curitas Ventures has a huge network of venture capital firms and PE firms, and of course I look forward to showing that our agenda works and being able to prove that you can work closely with organizations and work on diversity, work on inclusion, and acknowledging your own privileges, and create great business at the same time.
Yeah, that's sounds like great goals. So I really wish you the best of luck with those. And going back a little bit then to yourself here before we open up for questions. I mean, I know you're also involved in quite a few other organizations through a position in the board and so on. How do you manage your time? I mean, you seem like a very engaged person on all levels. How do you get your time to or basically how do you manage to squeeze everything in?
Well, I usually answer I don't have any hobbies, which I think helps, I guess. No, but it's true. I mean, I do love working, and I love. I mean, when you love what you do, it's not hard to do it all the time. I mean, that's a good beginning. And then also, yeah, I sit on several boards. I'm engaged in a few NGOs. I'm engaged in a few foundations that donate to NGOs. But I think, that's kind of what makes life fun, is to be able to move around in all of these different rooms, and also to get to do all of these different things. If someone told me, do you want to be a head of a venture capital firm whose only goal is to make money, and you're not allowed to engage in other things, I think I would directly turn that down. I mean, it's about being able to mix it all up. But then, of course, yeah, sometimes it's long days. But I mean, as I said, when you love what you do, it's not hard to do it.
No. Success, and also, I mean, just drive and activity comes at the price of setbacks and failure. Can you share with us some memorable setback or mistake, and what you learned from that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a interesting question. I think it's actually really hard to answer that question, because I think everything is a learning, and that sounds super cliche, but it's just true. I mean, I started a bunch of organizations when I was younger, in my early 20s, that definitely failed. But I mean, they're all been fun experiences. We tried to do something new and it hasn't worked. And I mean, it just always felt like that's fine. And I mean, with my engagement in different organizations, I often set out, world domination is what you want, but you can't reach that all the time. So of course there's going to be setbacks and failures. But yeah, I can't point to anything that's been traumatic in any way in my life with that. It's just been like, okay, that didn't work. What else can we do? Let's move on. That's how I see it.
But I think that, to me anyway, that's where the secret sauce lies, to have that approach. And I think that maybe the learning, at least that I take away, is that failures doesn't mean that you actually failed. It just means that you got to try with something else, and having that mindset. It's easier said than done sometimes, and for some people, and I think that's actually a great way to approach it, basically.
Yeah, and that's what makes great entrepreneurs often that we invest in, is people that are willing to fail. So if you're not willing to fail, you're not willing to take a risk, and you're not willing to try something new. And I mean, that's what you have to do all the time as an entrepreneur or as an investor. You also, I mean, my job is to take risks, and we know it, knowing that a lot of companies might fail. But that's a part of it. So if that was bringing me down, it wouldn't be a job for me.
If we take just some short questions before we open up the questions from the audience. Is there any book or author or some other source of information that has had a major impact on you throughout life?
Yeah, so a lot of the work I do, and a lot of my thoughts on how we can all be like feminist activists in our everyday life, stems from a scholar called Gerda Davis. And she writes about a concept that I think is easy and everyone should be using more often. So it's called rooting and shifting. So whenever we think about things that we do, or we meet new people and we hear new ideas, it's important that we are rooted in ourselves and understand ourselves. So often it's about privileges. No, so especially as an investor, I have a lot of privileges, or my story now that I told you is a story of privileges. No, it has to do with like freedom of travel, university degrees, convincing my parents to be able to move abroad, having enough wealth to do unpaid internships. It's so many different things that have to do with privilege. So in order to understand others and other solution, I have to really ground myself or root myself in those privileges. And then I can start to do the next step that she writes about, which is shifting. And that's when we like put ourselves in someone else's shoes and start trying to understand things from their perspective. And I think this is such an important thing to do, both as a human being and as a person, and in private relationships as well. But also when you sit in a position like me, if you have access to money, you have access to power. And then you have to really root yourself and be able to shift to use that power in the right way to create positive change, and not just change that affects you positively.
That's a great source of inspiration and good advice there. What would talking about advice? What advice, looking back now?
Yeah.
What advice would you give to our young, hungry, maybe student or young professionals that are early in their careers? To give themselves the best opportunities to develop and grow and reach their full potential, given the journey that you've had.
So I've never set goals like in 5 years I should do this or I want to do that. I've been a yay sayer to every opportunity that comes my way. I've never been scared of doing things because I don't know how to do them. I mean, we start university or we start school because we're going to learn things now, not because we already know it. So why would I take a job where I already know what I'm going to do if I can instead take it and learn? So that's been my approach. And then, of course, I've been fortunate enough to get those possibilities too, which again has to do with privileges in many ways. But I would just say, take every opportunity, ask if you can learn from other people, ask, can I come to that meeting with you? If you work at a company, can I listen in when you're fundraising? Because maybe you want to start your own company one day and you could learn from that, and just try to be a part of it all. And I think most people, as I know I said in another pod with Nova about women leaders, like if you call someone and you say, I don't ask for more than just a little bit of advice and 25 minutes of your time, and I'll buy the coffee. Can we meet? I'll come close to your office. Who would say no to that? I mean, people will of course say yes. And you will both expand your network, which is so important, but also gain new knowledge and maybe a new relationship.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice. And also my take is a little bit here that, no path is like the other one. And speaking about that, rooting and shifting again, I mean, listen to who you are and what your passions are. And for some people that might be to follow that, traditional path. And for others that might be just, following your heart and like you say, never stop learning and saying yes to those opportunities coming along. I think that's excellent advice. Let's move on to some questions from the audience here. I think this is a great one from Maya. She writes, you mentioned one has to give up power for another to gain it. What are your reflections about bringing in boys/men into the conversation about women's health as part of changing power structures?
So, I mean, I think that's and of course you have to do that. I mean, we have to have men and boys a part of the conversation, and especially when it comes to things like women's health. I mean, if we take women's sexual health, that's a hugely important part now in empowering women. But I think also it's important that we listen to women first of all and hear what they have to, what they want to change and how they want to change it, and then also bring in, of course, men and boys to the conversation. And when it comes to health, that also affects the whole society. So I'll just super quickly tell a short story. When I was working in Nepal, and we were doing this workshop where we were going to reflect on when we first learned about periods. And a guy say, well, My experience is that, or I now understand that I was 8 years old when I understood that I'm valued higher than my sister, because his sister had gotten her period and she was no longer able to eat at the table, and he wasn't allowed to play with her. And his father said to him, "But don't worry, this will never happen to you. Because you're a boy." So, I mean, there's a direct correlation between gender equality at large in society and health. So, of course, men and boys have to be a part of the conversation, I think.
Yeah. Another question from Clara. Hi, Gerda. Thanks a lot for such an inspiring talk. I wonder if you have any more advice on how female entrepreneurs could succeed in a business within women's rights.
Succeed in a business within women's rights. So I guess then the business has to do with women's rights also.
That's my interpretation as well.
Yeah. So unfortunately, a lot of the statistics that I mentioned earlier today is, of course, looking really sad in a lot of ways. But I think, I mean, it's there's definitely space for this, and it's a growing space. So it's just to continue fighting, but really trying to access those funders that have that passion and drive. And if you can't find them here, look abroad. A lot of women entrepreneurs I talk to that work with women's health or within women's rights actually have found more funding in, for example, the US or in the UK than they have in Sweden, where like impact funding has had a greater it's just more accessible in different ways. But yeah, my advice would be just like continue pushing. And
are there any areas that you see these are sort of green fields where it's where there are a lot of interesting initiatives to start, that you can point in any directions that you can point these entrepreneurs in?
No, I mean, I would love to start connecting on LinkedIn and have a conversation, and of course, grab that coffee that I talked about earlier. That could be a good start. But I think that there are, depending on what you want to do, I mean, there's so many ways of going about, and there's also what's called non-dilutive funding, which is funding that comes from governments or NGOs that you could use to actually scale these kind of businesses in the beginning.
Great. Here's a question that actually is sort of quite close to that, but let's take it up. What tips would you have to a younger female or male on how they can make a change when it comes to gender equality? I would love to include a little bit of us older males as well into that. I mean, seriously, we talked that, I mean, there's a journey ahead of us here in Sweden as well. It would be great to hear, like, how expand
no, I mean, I think, the easiest way to do, or the easiest thing to do, is start implementing it in your everyday lifestyle, or, everything that happens, everything from how you're at home, if you have a partner at home that's of another gender, or if you at work, who are you listening to, whose chances are you giving, or who's given the chances, and continue pushing. I mean, then of course I'm a big fan of, as you can see in my CV, like engaging in NGOs and pushing on strategical questions too. But I think there's a lot of things we can do just by calling people out, calling people biases out, and actually pushing for change in everyday life. But then also, I mean, start thinking about a question that you want to engage in, and then engage in that question, do it for a long time, because change isn't happening fast.
I assume different area of that, shifting. Are there anything else that we can do as a society to promote, to promote work in those structures where a lot of the power sit, where women might be underrepresented? I don't know exactly where that might
But I
be,
think
but
one thing we have to start doing, of course, is to measure more. And when we don't measure, we don't actually know about the issues. So, for example, we have the statistics that I mentioned on women and male entrepreneurs and who gets funding, but we have no idea what ethnicity they have, if they have disabilities, how much harder it is if you're a part of the LGBT community. I mean, so there's so many other things that we have to start asking. And the more we ask and the more statistics we get, the more we can start trying to change things. Because I think right now we have an issue with a lot of these. Well, when it comes at least to private capital, no one knows. We don't know where it's going. We don't know how family offices place their money, and then we won't know what we need to do to change things. So I mean, start measuring is definitely number one.
Yeah. Another thing that you've talked about previously is also having, people like yourself in the position that you're in, normalizing to have, women leaders in venture capital or in private equity or in those structures. So I think, that's great to have a person like yourself in that. One final question from me would be, how can we at Nova help make that change happen?
Well, I mean, I think Nova has started working on that. I think it's been great. I mean, I've had a lot of conversations with Magnus at Nova, for example, about gender equality. When we were making this list, I nominated about 20 people that were either women or not born in Sweden, but Swedish. Or people working here, for example. So that's how I try to help, and I think that's how Nova can open doors, is to also scrutinize the statistics of who's here and who's being represented, and making sure that we, like, what do we see as success, for example. Because if I come from a more privileged background, maybe I can come from up here to here, but someone else started much lower down and did not make it the whole way, but maybe they had actually more success because they had more against them in life, and start redefining those questions. But I think, looking at these kinds of lists and looking how on what talent you promote is, of course, one big part. And also what you're doing that I love is that you're creating all these connections between people. I met a lot of people through Nova that I stay in contact with, that I lunch with, that I meet up, and actually I bounce ideas with about diversity and inclusion because they have the same passion. And I met them through the speed dating that you arrange. So that's great.
It warms my heart to hear that. And I want to thank you for taking this time for a great conversation and, for being the person you are and a great role model. Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you, Niklas. Thank you for having me here.
Great. And thanks to everybody who's been listening in. Great having you. I wish you the best of days.